My name is Chuck Houseman, and I live in Georgetown now. I grew up in a little town in northern Virginia called Vienna, Virginia. And when the World War II broke out, I was approximately 12 years old and big for my age, but not old enough to go into service. And of course, in those days, after the war, there was a surge of patriotism like we have never seen before or since. And we were coming out of the Great Depression, and this accelerated that departure from the Depression because everybody all of a sudden had a job overnight in some form or fashion. In my instance, my dad, for example, worked at the Naval Torpedo Plant in Alexandria, Virginia, so he had a defense job. And I'll bring this up because one of the first things that occurred, it was rationing. Economic times were difficult right from the start. Gas was rationing, you couldn't buy cars, you couldn't buy tires, and naturally the government put out requests for metal, and that's one of my first jobs, I guess, voluntary jobs in that effort, because we all pitched in. All the eligible draftees, if you will, were flooding out of town. Even though the town was only 3,000, just about everybody in rock throwing distance had somebody of that age, and they were here one day, gone the next. So it kind of fell on the part of a lot of us teenagers to kind of do things that we ordinarily wouldn't do. For example, we supported the volunteer fire department. And if there was a fire, the truck was loaded with on top with a lot of teenagers to help. And then, of course, there were the older folks that were not draftable that kind of ran things as well. One of the first things that I did was to start collecting scrap metal, and in particular the requests were for aluminum goods, kitchen utensils made of aluminum. And I remember at the volunteer fire department we had an empty lot by it, and that pile of aluminum pots and pans, if you will, grew to the size almost of a Greyhound bus, and that was amazing for a small town and surrounding areas. It was a farm community primarily, somewhat of a bedroom community of Washington, D.C. We were 15 miles southwest of Washington. The next event of interest was that there was a hill in the middle of town, excuse me, that was one of the highest spots in the whole county, Fairfax County. And in the spring of '42, they started building this aerial observer tower. And they seemed to be all of the same. Later on I learned that they all were pretty much patterned alike. And naturally us boys, where I lived was 2 blocks away from this. And I had a paper route, I had a bicycle, we got all over town. We were always moving around and into things, you know. So naturally we were watching that tower go up, and every time when just about every opportunity when the workmen had gone for the day, we'd be climbing that thing just to see what kind of view they had. And starting in the spring, they occupied that with volunteers. They're mostly older men. And some of us used to hang around and gopher for them, you know. There was only one telephone in that tower, and it went straight to a central location in Washington, D.C., or somewhere around there. We don't know exactly. And we would call in all aircraft that we saw flying in and around and headed in that direction. And so we had to know what these, I say we because they kind of recruited me for times when they would go home for lunch or dinner. We would take over, and I never will forget one time I made a report after being thoroughly trained by the various people that I knew, and I knew their sons and daughters, you know, went to school with them. they would say, well, listen, while you're here, why don't you review this book? And it had pictures of silhouettes of various aircraft, American, for the most part, so we knew the good guys from the bad guys. And since it was that location, they gave us pictures of the German Air Force aircraft, so we would know which was which. And one of the first times when I was just standing in while a man went home for supper, I had to make a call, and the guy at the other end said, "Boy, how old are you anyway?" And I said, "I'm 12. And he said, "You got to be kidding." He says, "What the heck are you doing there?" So I said, "Well, I've been training here and helping these people for several weeks now." And he said, "That's good, keep it up." And he said, "About that plane, could you recognize what it was?" And he was testing me. I said, "Yeah, it was such and such. I think it was just a transport." And he said, "Okay, well, learn the silhouettes and you know, stay on it. We appreciate your help." And that aerial spotter tower was in operation from approximately the spring of 1942 until about the spring of 1944. The threat was not there anymore. They had adequate radar and stuff like that, so that was kind of dropped. And so throughout this time, when I wasn't, of course, I was going to school, and I started doing the night. We were manning that tower 24 hours a day, and I finally, with enough experience and time, the older folks didn't like to be, you know, on duty after midnight, and it was mighty quiet to boot, and it was mighty cold in the winter. But we'd have one little electric heater up there, and it just made do. You know what I mean? So after they closed that aerial spot tower down, I concentrated primarily on work. We had a large garden. You know, we all had victory gardens, and that was very important. We were still under the constraints of rationing, and that summer of '44, looking for something to do, even though there were jobs on dairy farms and the like, I took a chance on an effort that they had called Victory Farm Volunteers. And it was mostly made up of teenage boys throughout the Washington, D.C. area and surrounding areas. And they took us over to the eastern shore of Maryland, and we worked in cornfields. And we slept in high school gymnasiums on cots, and they fed us, and then of course we worked the cornfields all day. And it was a strange kind of project. All we did day in and day out for 2 summers was detassel corn. And because they were growing a special hybrid seed. And it's a long, involved technical process, but our part was strictly very basic. Just walk through the rows of corn, pull the stalk down, and it was pretty tall in those days, pull a tassel out and throw it down. Well, what made it more interesting is they take, it would be in one row, it would be a 13, 14, or 15-year-old kid, and in the next row is a German POW. And the next row is a kid, and the next row is a German POW. And some of those fields on the eastern shore were mighty big. I mean, hundreds of acres. And I never will forget, we would always work, by the time we worked one row, we would, at the end of it, it would be almost time to eat lunch. And there was always one German POW could speak a certain amount of English, and there was always one kid that could speak a certain amount of German. So we'd all get in a big circle and pass our sandwiches around, and the Germans were very cognizant of our presence. You know, some of them had kids of their own our age, and they always were interested in what our, shall we say, translator, to use a better term, was saying about his lifestyle and what we were doing and where we lived and all like that, and then they would reverse the process. Most of these POWs were from the North African campaign. And I never will forget that for some strange reason, see, my dad was also at night a watchmaker. He repaired watches at the house. And he gave me a pocket watch to take with me when I went out to this place in Maryland for the summer. And it was a Popeye watch with the arms doing the reading. And when we first went out in the field, no one, not even the two overseers, one of which was an Army guy that was wounded badly in North Africa, had a watch. And they passed the word around, has anybody got a watch? And I held up my hand. And so every day they grabbed my watch, and at the end of the day they give it back to me. And one day they found a watch to use themselves. And so I was sitting there in the lunch circle, if you will, and somebody asked for the time, and I pulled it out and read the time to them because we had a certain amount of time to eat and then get back to work. And this German guy next to this fellow that asked the question, I handed it to him, he looked at it, he handed it back, and the German guy gave me this, and I handed it to him. And they thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen, Popeye. They call it Popeye. And they passed it around, all the Germans, and they all laughed uproariously because, you know, they're used to precision instruments. And here's this stupid pocket watch with Popeye on it, and they just couldn't get over that. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting interlude, you know, in the middle of all that. And that I did for the summer of 1943 and 1944 and 45, because I remember we were working in the fields when the word was passed to us in 45 that they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And that was essentially, you know, working a paper out, going to school, doing these odd volunteer jobs to support the war effort because everybody was involved. And I think, you know, we had to gear up quick, and we did. And it seemed to be, well, I don't think that the rationing was difficult because we were working our way out of a depression. Today, if something like that were to hit the way that hit, I just don't know what, you know, how the populace would take it. It would be very difficult. And so, at the end of the war, after I graduated from high school after the war, you know, all the veterans were coming back. I mean, you couldn't find a job doing anything except maybe digging ditches for a plumber or something like that. So I went in the service, and I was in 24 years afterwards and retired in the early 70s. To explain that a little better, and I'm glad you asked that question, we would detassel the corn. Let's say there's a huge field, and surrounding that field on the outside is a bank of a special type of corn that they did not detassel. And there's pollen on the corn tassel itself, not the corn silk. But the wind would blow it, and it would pollinate the ear by dropping, the pollen would drop onto the corn silk. And that created this hybrid seed. And we never saw where it went, because once we did our job and left, we'd go to another job. But I heard later on, I think it was in late 45 or somewhere, it was an article in the paper, or maybe they had a little newsy letter that they sent out for the old VFV guys, Victory Farm Volunteers, that all this corn was stored in a huge warehouse in Baltimore, and it burned down. So all that 2-year effort, as far as I know, that 2-year effort was futile. I don't know what else. I didn't know what the purpose was of it. I wasn't that interested whether they were going to use it in the United States or for some other purpose overseas. Well, I was in the Korean War as an enlisted man. Then I went to flight school after in the early 50s, and then I served as a Marine Corps pilot. And I had 3 tours in Vietnam as a pilot, and it was in '72 when allegedly the Vietnam War was over, and that's when I retired. I say allegedly because it kind of drug on to 1975, as you know. And I moved down here in the early '70s. The world has changed in their attitudes, and as you know, it's reported daily and almost every day in some form or fashion in newspapers or other media. The Pearl Harbor thing was such a shock. Now, I know the 911 was a shock also, and I thought the response was similar, but then again, it wasn't to that depth. This was a stop everything and go in a different direction, and everybody, you know, from a small child up, was cognizant and participating in some form or fashion. And of course, we've been doing as far as conflicts like the Korean thing, people realize, they always seem to realize at the beginning that yes, we must do this, but before the thing is over, everybody's turned dead set against it. That certainly wasn't the case in World War II. We were glad to see it over with and encouraged it. And we were thankful, I think, looking back, that we ended the war before we had to invade Japan. But that would have been disastrous. I mean, the casualties would have been awesome. And fortunately, the means were terrible, but still, in the long run, when you analyze it, I think that was a proper step. I think we're guilty of one thing that I don't mind telling you now, but I thought, thinking back, I was a little embarrassed by it. We would work with these German POWs in the field all day, and then of course a truck would come and take them away back to their camp. And then a truck would come and take us back to that high school, and the camp was only about, I would say, 5 miles or so from where we stayed in this little town called Sudlersville, Maryland, in a high school gym. And as at least the first summer, as we drove by there was always some in the group. We're standing up in a stake body truck, and there's always somebody in the group as they go by that camp, which was right alongside this road that we used going back and forth. They would start swearing at these POWs. You know, that attitude was there, but the old Sarge, as we call him, the one who was hurt bad in North Africa, he, after a couple times like that, with all that invective thrown at, he said, look, lay off that, I don't want to see that anymore. And there was always that type of feeling, you know, deep down. But basically, I remember working later in a dairy farm and working with them in the cornfields, because there was a dairy farm that I also worked at, jumping milk. You know, you used to put milk in front of your front porch, you know, you remember delivering quart bottles of milk. And when you have to cut the silage, you know, the corn down and put it in silage, you know, we would bring the German POWs in there to work, because that was a quick effort and a massive effort. And we were told up front, and it always worked, if you fed them good, they'll work like dogs. And I'll tell you what, I can remember they'd lay all this food out on these planks on sawhorses, and these POWs literally were drooling until they went through that line. I mean, they fed them good. I mean, as good as any picnic I've ever been to, you know, as a grown-up. February 1943 issue, and it just shows a picture of a guy as an air spotter, an older gent, and I know how he feels about it. And there's a picture in here also of a tower that's very similar, if not identical, to the one they built, so it was kind of a common stamp. And we didn't have these at first, but later on they passed these around. But these decks of cards that they would use to identify aircraft. Up until they made these cards, we were looking through kind of a notebook type rendering. And so this is a reproduction, but I had all these certificates of thanks and all, and pins and all from aerial spotters. The association, I guess the Federal Association, and they were stored in my attic in my house, but we rented it, and the kids got into some of that stuff, and I never did see it again.